Hi there! In this video we will take a look at the functionality of this chat application developed using Node.js, MongoDB for the database and React in the frontend. This chat application saves all messages in a MongoDB database, which allows users to keep a record of their conversation, ensuring that messages are stored and can be accessed later, even after restarting the app or logging out. So the main goal of this video is to explain you the core functionalities of the chat system, including how messages are sent and received and how users are able to see their chat history. We are going to focus on everything related to the chat functionality, since the authentication part was explained in a previous video that I have linked in the description. In that video, the login, sign up and everything related to them are covered, so we're going to skip that part and get straight to the point, which is the chat itself. But if you're not interested in the authentication part and want to jump straight to the chat functionality, you can still follow this video without knowing the details of the authentication. I will leave the project code in the description, which you can clone and it will work right away. In this way you can dive straight into the more exciting stuff, which is the logic of the chat itself. So now let's see the application in action. Here's the sign up page where I have already created several accounts. I'm going to log in with one called George, and once logged in we're taken to the feed where you can see the list of users who are part of the application. This is where you can select someone to start a conversation with or continue chatting with existing contacts. And now I'm going to click on Anne, where I already have an ongoing conversation. As you can see, her messages appear on one side and mine are on the others. This layout helps distinguish between sent and received messages, making the conversation easy to follow. And now we can type a message. I have to get back to work. See you later. And it will be saved in this conversation. Notice that as the conversation gets longer, a scroll bar appears, allowing you to view all the messages without changing the size of the chat or the screen. So that's something important to program in the frontend. So now if we log out of this account and log in as Anne, and we go to George, we will see the newly received message appear in her chat window. The UI or design of this chat application might not be particularly impressive, but the key takeaway for this video is the functional code. My focus is to provide you with a fully working chat system, and from here you can customize the design or improve the styles as much as you like. The real value lies in understanding the logic behind the code, which you can then build upon. I just let you know I'm working with the latest version of Node.js, which means I'm not using NodeMon or .env. The updated Node.js version includes built-in capabilities that replace the need for these packages. If you want to install this new version and easily switch between it and older versions when needed, check out the video linked in the description for a guide on how to do that. As you see, for example, in this command, we are using Node.js built-in flag to automatically restart the server when changes are detected. This means you no longer need nodemon for this functionality. And the -m file, this flag, manage environment variables, making .env also unnecessary. Regarding the MongoDB connection, I established the connection by storing the MongoDB URI in this .env file, and that means it will not appear in the GitHub repository I'm leaving you in the description, because all we include in a .env file is sensitive information such as database, credentials, AP keys, and other private data. And for this application, I'm connecting to a remote MongoDB Atlas cluster, which requires an authentication user and password in MongoDB Atlas. But if you don't want to do it that way, you can connect to a local MongoDB instance running on your computer without any authentication. And I will leave you another link in the description showing you how to do that. Alright, so having clarified all of this, let's get started. So in the routes folder, we have the users file where the routes are defined. File, you will find all the logic needed to make the chat functionality work. Notice that up to this point, the setup is similar to the video where I explained user authentication. This includes handling user sign up, login, securing routes using JSON Web Token authentication. So for a detailed explanation of that functionality, I recommend you to watch that video, which will be linked in the description. Here we will focus only on the logic for the chat, not for the authentication. So having said this, let's begin with this route that is responsible for fetching and displaying all the users that have an account in our chat application. So when a GET request is made to this high endpoint, it triggers an asynchronous function that retrieves all users and displays them on the feed. So here you can see the screen where all users are displayed in the application, and this is possible thanks to the high endpoint which retrieves and shows all the users from the database. And the way this is achieved is through this find method that is used to retrieve data from a collection. When you use user.find, it searches the user collection and returns all the documents that match the given query. In this case, we would pass an empty object, meaning that we want to find all users. And this method returns an array of user documents, and since it's an asynchronous operation, it's often used with an await keyword that wait for the database response before moving on in the code. And after that, we send the data back as a JSON response, making it available for the client to display the users on the screen. Let's remember that the find method is querying this user model. This schema defines the structure of a user document in database, including fields like username, password, email. And when we use user find, it's specifically searching through this model, which represents all users stored in the collection. Alright, so let's continue with this route that represents the most important part of the chat functionality. It handles the process of sending messages between users. When a user sends a message, this route receives the necessary data from the request, create a new message in the database, and responds to the client with a confirmation that the message was successfully sent. This is a post route, meaning it is designed to handle incoming data from the client. Every time the user sends a message, the client sends a post request to this route, along with the message data, such as the sender ID, recipient ID, and the message text. The first line within the try block uses the structuring assignment to extract specific properties from the incoming request body. In this case, it pulls out sender ID, recipient ID, and message text, which are fields from the data that this client sends to the server. And then what we are going to do with this data that we extract here, we create a new instance of the message model, which represents a single message in the database. This message model that we import right here is located here, and it represents the structure of a message exchanged between users in the chat. And what we basically see in this model is a relationship between the message and the user's model. This relationship is established through the sender ID and the recipient ID, those fields which both reference the user model. The sender ID represents the user who is sending the message, and it is linked to the user model via the typed mongoose schema types object ID, which refers to the user model. Similarly to the recipient ID, which represents the user who is receiving the message. And this field also refers a user from the user model. And this creates a one-to-many relationship between users and messages. A single user, the sender or the recipient, can be involved in many messages, and each message can point back to the users who are participating in the chat through these references. And this relationship allows querying the message model and retrieving relevant user information from the user model. And then we have the message field that stores the text of the message. And as we see in this route, we assign what we are extracting from the requested body, that this message text field, we are assigning to the message model and created a new instance of a new message. For example, when you send a message to a specific user, for example, let's pick David and say, "Hi, how are you?" When the sender clicks send, the data is package into a request that includes the sender ID, recipient ID, and message text. As we console log receive data, this is the data that we are sending to the backend, and this message is now stored with its content along with the object ID reference to the sender and recipient users from the user collection with this reference. And once the message is saved through this instruction .save, then we will respond with a success message, and the frontend updates to display the new message in the chat between the sender and the recipient. So the relationship between the message and user models ensures that each message is clearly associated with both the sender and the recipient. Good, so now let's move on to the following route. This get route is responsible for retrieving the chat history between two users based on their unique ID, sender ID and recipient ID. So when a request is made to this route, the server queries the database for messages exchanged between these two users, regardless of who sent or received them. And once found, the messages are returned as a JSON response. So in this case, I'm talking with David. I'm George talking with David. If I go to David's account, I go to George. I'm fine. So as you see, once I open the conversation with George, the application triggers a request to this route, passing in the sender ID and the recipient ID of the user you are chatting with. And what the backend will do is to, based on those IDs, it will search for all messages exchanged between you and the selected user by calling this get route. And how we extract these IDs that the client is sending to us, by using this object destructuring to extract those values from the URL parameters. Request.params is an object that contains these parameters passed in their URL. In the request.body, the data comes from the body of the request, and in request.params, the data comes from the URL parameters, which are part of the route path. And once we have these values, we query the message model to find messages between two users, the sender and the recipient. First, we search for documents in the message collection that match the condition specified here within the method. With this OR operator, we check for messages that meet either of the two conditions. Message where sender ID is the sender and recipient is the recipient, and messages where sender ID is the recipient and recipient is the sender. This allows fetching messages sent in both directions, from sender to recipient and vice versa. And then with this populate function, the sender ID field will be replaced with the full user object containing the user's ID and the name, rather than just showing the sender's object ID. This is helpful when displaying messages on the frontend because it provides meaningful information about who sent the message. And all this will be stored in these constant messages, and this is what we will be sending to the client in a JSON format. And this route is useful for fetching and displaying user details, such as in a profile view or chat application where user information is required. In this case, we will use for this part of this view of the specific conversation that we want to display who we are talking with, and for that we need to retrieve the details of a specific user based on their unique user ID, and that user ID should be passed as a parameter in the function or route path that then should be extracted from these requests.params. And then the route use this user find by ID to search the database for a user document with the matching user ID. If a matching user ID found, it sends the user's data stored in recipient ID back as a JSON response. Alright, now it's time to focus on the frontend or the client side of our application. We are in the app.js file that typically plays the role of the main component that serves as the entry point for the entire application. And in this part of the code, the login and authentication process are handled, ensuring that users can securely log in and access different sections of the chat application. However, since I have already covered the details of authentication in a previous video, I won't dive into those specifics here. You can find that video linked in the description, where I explain the authentication flow in depth. And the same goes for the styles. Here you will see a design that I put together, but the key focus is to understand how the logic in the code works. That's the purpose of this video. And once you grasp that, you will be able to apply your own styles or even improve upon the design while keeping the same underlying logic. So, to dive deeper into the construction of this application, following the authentication part that we already saw in the other video, let's go straight to the chat room view. And this part of the code is responsible for setting up the chat room component in React. The chat room is where we typically see the other users who are available for chatting. That's the part of the application. It's the central view where you can find a list of users, and from there you can choose who to start a conversation with. And this component serves as the hub for interaction within the chat application, allowing you to easily navigate and select different users to chat with. And this component receives a user as prop, which contains the logged in user's data. Remember, in the part of the code of the logged in users. Logged in routes, which is the function responsible for defining the routes available to logged in users. And here is where the user and logout props are passed to the chat room component. This means that both the logged in user's data and the logout function are provided as props from the app.js file. And this user information is provided by this function. If a token exists, it makes a GET request to the backend, this endpoint, and to fetch the user data. And once the user data is received, it's stored in the user state via setUser, and this is the information that is passed to the chat room component. So in this chat room component, the functionality involves fetching and displaying a list of users who are available to chat. And for that, first of all, we have to focus on the state management that is handled by this variable users. This state holds the array of users retrieved from the backend, initially set as an empty array. Then we have a useFect hook that runs when the component is first rendered. Since the dependency array is empty, it runs only once. And within this useFect hook, we have the load initial users function. And this asynchronous function sends a GET request to the backend to fetch that list of users. Then the response.data contains the array of users, which is stored in new users. And then the function filters out the logged in user from the list, so the current user won't see themselves in the chat room. Basically, here we are filtering out the logged in user from the list of users fetched from the backend. So the goal is simply to exclude the currently logged in user from the list of users displayed in the chat room. Normally you don't see yourself in a chat room to chat with yourself. That, well, except in WhatsApp, but that's different because you want to save some relevant information you want, but in this chat room you will not see yourself. And then once we exclude ourselves from the chat room, we store in the users state all the list of users using this setUsers function that the useState functionality provides us. Then we handle the errors in the catch block, and then this part after the return, this part of the component handles the rendering of the user interface, specifically the list of users available for chatting. So the user state variable holds the filtered list of users, excluding me in this case, and is mapped over to create a list of elements. And for each user in the users array, an individual list item is created. Each item has a key attribute set to user ID to identify it. And inside each li element, the link component from the React Rotterdam is used to create a clickable link so that we can enter to specific chat. So in summary, we are generating a list of clickable links to start a chat with other users in the chat room. Each user's name is displayed, all the names here, and clicking on the link navigates to the corresponding chat page. And now let's move on to the component that renders the specific chat. This is where the individual chat interface is built, allowing the logged in user to communicate directly with another user. We start again by importing the hooks and React, and then from React router down, use params is imported to access route parameters, specifically to get the recipient's ID from the URL. Then we receive the user prop, which includes the logged in user's information, and then we extract route parameters. In this case, the recipient we extract the recipient ID parameter from the URL. This ID represents the user with whom the logged in user is chatting with. And then regarding the state management, this use state form data is used to manage the form data from related to the chat message, and to manage the chat form data more efficiently and avoid handling each field individually, you can use a single state object. This approach keeps the state management organized and simplifies updating multiple fields, because within this object we have sender ID, that is the ID of the logged in user, recipient ID, which retrieve the ID of the recipient that we get from the URL, the message text, that is the actual text of the message, initially set as an empty string. Then these lines set up additional state variables for managing chat messages and recipient data. And the purpose of these state variable messages is used to store the list of messages in the current chat. It is initialized as an empty array that indicates that there are no messages yet. And set messages is the function used to update this state. And then with recipient data, we store information about the recipient of the chat. This might include details like the recipient's username or profile picture or other relevant information. It is initialized as undefined because the recipient's data might not be available immediately, and it will be set once the data is fetched from the backend or provided through some other means. Alright, now let's dive into the functions, as every React component typically has some functionality. Here we begin with the fetch message function, which is responsible for retrieving the chat messages from the server. And here we make an API request to fetch the conversation between the logged in user, the current user, and the recipient, and it updates the state with the retrieved messages. So we make an asynchronous request to the backend to retrieve the chat messages between the logged in user and the recipient, and how we make the reference to each of them just by passing user ID of the current user and the recipient ID, and how we access to the ID of the current user just by applying a dot notation to the user object, as long as the current object contains an ID property of the current user I'm receiving as a prop from the app.js file. And To get the recipient ID, as I explained before, we use params from React Router DOM, which allows to access any dynamic parameter defined in your route. And we define that here in this route. Recipient. It's a typo there. It's with I, but I realized that a little bit late, so I had to do that the whole application with that typo. But anyway, in order to make the application work, it's okay. And then what we get as a response is converted to a JSON format using response.json. And if the response is successful, the setMessage function is called to update the message state with the fetch data, which contains the chat messages. And if there is an error, we console log. After that, with the useFect hook, we ensure that that function fetchMessage is called when the component mounts. And we make it run only once by setting this empty dependency array. So if we successfully update the messages state, then we are able to display the conversation between the current user and the person he wants to chat. And if we go quickly to the interface we're rendering, we see that we are mapping through this message state variable, which is an array, and for each message we create a div with the class of either send or receive, depending on whether the current user is the sender of the message. This part means the current user sent the message, so the class is sent. Otherwise, it's received. And the appearance of the chat messages is controlled by the CSS classes message.send and message.receive, which determine the background color, the text color, and alignments for messages sent by the current user and received from others. And you see the React component, the CSS classes, are applied dynamically based on whether the message was sent by the current user or received from others. And this is done in the chat screen messages section of the component, where each message is rendered conditionally with the appropriate CSS class. Inside the messages.map function, each message is a given div with a class of either sent or received, depending on who sent that message. And that's the condition that checks if the current user sent the message. If it's true, the send class is applied. If it's false, the receive class is applied. Keep in mind message.sender.id refers to the ID of the user who sent the message. And user ID refers to the ID of the currently logged in user. And remember, these routes correspond to the one we already explained in the backend section to this route. And the next one we're going to see now is this one. And this function basically is responsible for fetching and storing information about the recipient, like the username, and it allows us to display recipient specific details such as the name. As you see here, my chat with George, or it can be with any one of these users. And for that we send a GET request to the API at this route endpoint, and the recipient ID is dynamically inserted into the URL to specify which user's data we to retrieve. And in the dependency array we include recipient ID, which means the effect will run whenever the value of recipient ID changes. So it will only run, the hook will only run, the side effect will only run when the component first mounts and when the value of recipient ID changes. Remember, recipient ID represents the ID of the user the current user is chatting with. This ID might change if the user switches to another chat. So by including this recipient ID as dependency, the code ensures that every time the recipient changes, the use effect will run again and fetch the new recipient's data from the server. And we store this in this variable, recipient data. We render here. And this function handle send is responsible for sending the message to the user we are chatting with. And the function makes a post request to the API endpoint, which is where the backend receives new messages. And we are sending the current message data from form.data here, this variable. This information is what we are interested to send to the backend. And we send it in the request body using JSON.stringify to convert the object into a JSON string. The headers specify that the content type of the request is JSON content type. And after sending the request, if the response is okay, it checks whether the server responded with a successful status. So if the response is successful, then it clears the message field in form data by calling this set form data, which resets the message input field for the user. Then we apply this function here.